Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Sunday, March 10th, and today is day 156 since October 7th. It was reported in the news in the last 24 hours that 5 children have been killed in a humanitarian aid drop, according to the Ministry of Health coming out of Gaza. Normally on Sundays, I like to try to offer a word of encouragement because over the last 156 days, there has been so much news that's just devastating to hear. Day by day, dozens and dozens of people are being killed in Gaza. There still are hostages being held there. There is grief abounding. And so during the season of Lent, as we're preparing our hearts for Easter, it's appropriate for us to lament and to grieve, but also to be compelled to action. So every Wednesday we have a prayer gathering, and one of the prayers that was shared was by John Habibi, which Habibi means like my beloved, or it's often something in Arabic, you call, a child or a young person or someone you care deeply about, Habibi for a boy, Habibti for a girl. And the prayer is, prepare our hearts to be vessels of peace and understanding, granting us the wisdom to speak with humility and the courage to listen with empathy. We've shared that on social media this past week, and I thought it was a beautiful prayer for today. Prepare our hearts to be vessels of peace and understanding, granting us the wisdom to speak with humility and the courage to listen with empathy. One of the things that's been quite profound since October 7th, and this has always been a challenge between Israelis and Palestinians in general, post the Oslo Accords, that was a time of great hope. There were a lot of people-to-people initiatives. But after the Second Intifada, increasingly, Palestinians living in the occupied territories have been isolated from Israelis. Many times they say that the only Israelis they know are soldiers or settlers. And so after October 7th, one of the things that happened is that for Israelis, Jewish Israelis, there has been virtually no capacity for any empathy for what's happening to Palestinians in the West Bank, let alone in Gaza, and vice versa. So for Palestinians living in the West Bank, even before water, gas, and electricity was turned off in Gaza, and before tens of thousands of people were being killed, Palestinians had little empathy for the brutal murders on October 7th. And some of that has to do with news. One of the things I was profoundly impacted by in January was a Jewish Israeli woman said to us, it's unbelievable the way that the news in Israel doesn't tell you the details of what's happening in Gaza. She said it's almost so bad that it seems like the way the news, the way that propaganda is like in Russia, where you're limited by what you're told, and vice versa in the Palestinian territories. They don't talk about the incidents of sexual violence, or they don't talk about the massacres, or that you, forgive me for being grotesque, you could see pictures of bodies just on October 7th that are so horrific. And for Palestinians, they say we have been killed, time and time again, and the world has ignored the death of Palestinians. And they are isolated in their own suffering. And for many Jewish people, they're isolated in their own suffering. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes today talking about empathy. Empathy is defined as the reality or the ability to be able to understand and share the feelings of another. And after the October 7th attacks, it became very clear that there was little to no room for there to be empathy shown, across the divisions of Jews living in Israel and Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. And I think part of the reality was that after October 7th, the hostages being taken and the news reporting about the atrocities and the horrors of that day, at least in the American media, Palestinians, in Gaza were so dehumanized, and the U.S. government, the language that was being used was so dehumanized, and the language coming out of the Israeli government then and now continues to be so dehumanizing. And so you started to see behaviors in Israel where Palestinian citizens of Israel were treated similarly to the way Japanese Americans were treated during World War II. Their shops were shut down. They were treated as suspect. There was a campaign in Israel in October and thereafter where, and this is even true some now, but where people in Israel who were supportive of Palestinians in Gaza, or who were calling for an end to the bombing there, they were threatened that they were going to be taken and dropped off in Gaza and left there if they showed any empathy. So when we talk about empathy, empathy is a precursor to compassion. Compassion means to suffer together or suffer alongside. Researchers define it as the feeling that arises when we're confronted with one another's suffering. And not only that, we're motivated to relieve that suffering. So empathy is a precursor to compassion. And then, I write in Social Justice Handbook, Small Steps for a Better World, about how compassion and justice are very different. Compassion is about the desire to relieve someone's suffering, and justice is about addressing systemic causes, right? 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 3-5 says, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, the one who suffers with and desires to relieve our suffering, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all of our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. So God comforts us so that we can bring comfort to others. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. Might those verses just resonate with us from 2 Corinthians, that God shows us comfort, that we can comfort those in trouble with the comfort that we ourselves have received from God. It's an encouragement to me that when we're going so hard and, when we're working so diligently, that we have to stay deeply rooted in community and deeply rooted in, our spiritual disciplines, that our strength has to come from God above and from the community around us. I wanted to give just a couple of examples. There has been so much lack of empathy. I had a conversation this fall with an Israeli friend of mine, and he was from an ultra-Orthodox community. He left, lived in Tel Aviv for a long time. He now lives here in the United States. He works with Israelis here in the US who have immigrated to the US from Israel. And he said, it's not fair for us to ask people to have empathy in this moment. He said, but it is right for us to expect them to be able to do what is right. And so he was talking about, let's not call people to empathy, let's call them to morality, right? So we don't have to ask people that their hearts be softened at this moment because they're in so much pain, that Jewish people have been in so much pain, but we can call them to morality when it comes to perspectives about what's happening in Gaza. And I just thought that was interesting to think about. I can tell you that, there was a big article that came out, CNN put this out on March 8th, and you're seeing this all over the news. People in Israel are seeking to block the aid that is going into Gaza. Now, some of that motivation is so that the hostages, many of those are families of those being held hostage. Some of that is so hostages will be released. And I don't know that we can understand the frustration and the anger that they're experiencing, but that type of action does not show any empathy for the millions of people in Gaza who are starving and suffering, right? Now, the frustration and anger, there's so much politicization about what's happening in terms of the hostages being held. But blocking aid from people who don't have water and food shows a lack of empathy, right? And there's also anger and frustration at the dehumanization of Palestinian lives. And that's perfectly legitimate. But we have to move away from the zero-sum game mentality. Another place where I see lack of empathy is for pro-Palestinian protesters. I don't understand it does not minimize the call to justice for Palestinians to have empathy for an Israeli mother whose son or daughter, has been held or is being held in Gaza. It strengthens our call for justice to have empathy for that mother. And so that's another place where we've seen lack of empathy. But there are places, and these are like the little silver linings that people say, where do you have hope? And these are where I have hope. Vivian Silver, you've heard her name mentioned a lot, a peace activist, one of the founders of Women Wage Peace. She was killed on October 7th by Hamas. She was someone who said, military deterrence will not work. We have to pursue peace we have to pursue peace nonviolently. And her son, who lost his mother on October 7th, is one of the leading voices who is a peace activist who is saying we have to call for a ceasefire. What's happening in Gaza is wrong. That is the greatest kind of empathy there is. And we see, these Israeli human rights activists who, at risk to their own bodily harm and even taking their own lives at risk, are walking alongside Bedouins in South Hebron so that, Palestinians in South Hebron, so their homes will not be demolished and their sheep will not be killed and destroyed by settlers. That's empathy, right? And Palestinians who are willing to engage in ceasefire protests with Israeli counterparts, they're risking being branded as normalizers. right? And I think about friends of mine like Aziz Abu Sarah, who's from Jerusalem, who is a peace activist, and he's one of the founders of Combatants for Peace. His brother was killed by the Israeli military, and he is constantly crossing the divide and having empathy for, Jewish friends. And he's the first one. He taught me that when you see someone suffering, reach out to them and tell them that you are with them. And that is a transformational experience for us, to have empathy, to ask God to give us hearts. That World Vision prayer, break our hearts for the things that break the heart of God, that we would have empathy, for the other, not that we even want to see one another as other, but the world does, right? That we would have empathy, that empathy would become compassion, that we would pursue justice and address systemic issues. Now, I know that this is simplistic in light of, all of the other issues I talk about and we talk about and what's going on in Gaza. Let me just say this. Having empathy does not minimize that there is a grotesque violation of human rights with the ongoing bombing of Gaza that has got to be brought to an end. Empathy makes the claim for a comprehensive ceasefire stronger. Justice and liberation for Palestinians, bringing an end to the occupation, having empathy, for Jewish Israelis who are calling for hostages to be released does not minimize the call for justice for Palestinians. It actually strengthens it. So might God go before us, God give us hearts, might he prepare our hearts to be vessels of peace and understanding, granting us the wisdom to speak with humility and the courage to listen with empathy, as John Habibi led us in prayer and as we began. Lord, have mercy. Amen.